Timme and Rasir Bolton played their final games at the McCarthy Athletic Center on Wednesday in a win over Chicago State. We celebrate those moving on and question the WCC award decisions right here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Don't go away.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Well, happy March 2nd. We are a few days into the greatest month of the year. The Zags have closed out the regular season with a big victory over Chicago State in a tune-up game senior night for Timme, for Rasir Bolton, also for Anton Watson, for Malachi Smith, potentially for Julian Strawther and other players who may have played their final game in the Kennel. We'll talk about that more in the final segment. We're also going to talk about the WCC awards. Timme, co-player of the year with Brandin Podziemski of Santa Clara. If you watch the broadcast, you know that the broadcasters, namely Richard Fox, had some thoughts about Timme sharing that award. There was also plenty of controversy and discussion about Anton Watson being selected as an honorable mention. We'll talk about that. But first, I want to talk about this game on Wednesday, what it meant for the Zags, what it meant for Timme, what it meant to kind of close out the regular season, a more up and down regular season than we've seen from the Zags in the past. But in a game like this, topped 100 points, 104-65 was the final score. Not surprising against a pretty bad, low-budget Chicago State program, but the Zags topped 108 times this year. That's a program record in what has been considered a down year for the Zags. Yes, two of those came here against Chicago State, one of them against Eastern Oregon, an NAIA program. So there's a little tiny bit of a grain of salt there. Some people will point out that, oh, the WCC, blah, blah, blah. That's not really the case. They got 100 against Alabama, for example. I don't think that there's not a lot of arguments you can make there. But yeah, Chicago State, obviously not a great program, but for this team to top 108 times in a season proves that the offensive firepower is absolutely there. I love that they scheduled this game. Yes, senior night is more fun when it's against BYU or St. Mary's or even some of the other higher level WCC opponents, but the Zags have too often had this really long gap between when they play in the WCC tournament, which lately has been not until Monday or Tuesday. So they have this entire week plus off. Oftentimes they have 9 or 10 days between games. So this makes a ton of sense to me. Get a game where you don't have to worry too much about the result. You don't have to worry too much about whether you're going to win the game. You can send your seniors off in style. You can get them good minutes, get them good action, get them kind of staying in game shape without having to tax them too much, and while still getting opportunities to play some of your younger guys, some of the players who might be a bigger part of the future. And that's pretty much exactly what Gonzaga did in this game. The game started with seniors. Malachi Smith started over Nolan Hickman, which is totally unsurprising considering the circumstances. Watson fed Timme for the opening bucket, and we were off. Senior power in this one. Timme finished with 17 points, 4 boards, 3 assists, 2 blocks on 7 of 10 shooting in 27 minutes. Hyper efficient night from the big fella, the final one for him in the McCarthy Athletic Center. Rasir Bolton, the other player who we know with certainty that it is his final game because he does not have any more eligibility remaining. Bolton finished with 15 points, 2 assists, a steal, and a board. 5 of 10 from the field, but 4 of 7 from deep in 24 minutes. Anton Watson, 7 assists, 10 points for him, 4 steals, 3 boards, 2 blocks on 3 of 4 shooting. Another one of those crazy efficient nights from Anton. And then Malachi Smith, 14 points, 9 boards, and a steal, 4 of 5 shooting in a game high 29 minutes for him. So we saw the seniors kind of come in, do what we expected them to do, have a really dominant, really efficient, and just look like they were having fun. They just looked like they were having fun. And that, at the end of the day, that's kind of what you want. There was a little bit of a lull early in this game before Gonzaga really took off. Once they took off, things were pretty darn easy after that. And so it was nice to see the seniors come out, have some fun, ham it up with the crowd, hit some big shots, get to celebrate, but not have to do anything so taxing and daunting and exhausting that you worry about whether they're going to be able to turn it around and play successfully on Monday and Tuesday before, of course, heading into the NCAA tournament the week after that. Beyond the seniors, it was good to see some other players get opportunities as well. Players who we know are going to be back. We don't know about Anton Watson. We don't know about Malachi Smith. To an extent, we don't know about Julian Strawther. I didn't mention him here. But we do know that Drew Timme's gone. We do know that Rasir Bolton's gone. And so seeing the players who might step into some of those roles was an important part of this game as well. And they're not secrets. You know, it's Ben Gregg and Hunter Salas for the most part. Like, we've seen them quite a bit this year. Hunter Salas played 26 minutes in this game. It was not his strongest game, at least from a box score perspective. 4 points, 4 boards, 2 steals, and an assist. He fouled out in those 25 minutes, missed all 3 of his 3-pointers. None of them were bad shots. One of them was not a great shot. The other 2 were good shots. They just didn't knock down. But he also had the highlight of the day, one of the highlights of the entire season. There's 2 fantastic highlights in this game. Anton Watson alley-oop throwdown to Julian Strawther, and a great assist from Watson to Strawther. But the other one was Hunter Salas gets a steal, gets on a breakaway. I think he only took 1 step from inside the 3-point line and threw down an absolute hammer of a dunk. It should have been all over SportsCenter. I didn't stay up late enough to see if it was, but it absolutely should have been. It was a fantastic play and a very good description of what's to come for Hunter. I think next year you see him step into a starting role, whether I think there's a chance that he starts alongside Nolan Hickman. And I think there's actually a real chance, we'll talk about this more in the offseason, but I think there's a chance that Hunter Salas steps into the starting point guard role next year, and that they kind of transition Nolan Hickman into a bit more of an off-ball role. We've seen Gonzaga start 2 point guards in the past. Hunter Salas has pretty distinctly been playing point guard when he comes into the game. And I think there's an opportunity for those 2 guys to kind of be the primary ones in a 2 point guard lineup next season, if that's the direction that Mark Few wants to go. Mentioned Strawther, this potentially being his final home game as well. He had 11 points and 4 assists in this one. I think he's NBA bound. We'll talk about him a little bit more in the third and final segment. And, of course, a bunch April, May, and June leading up to the draft, depending on when we hear about a decision from him. But if this was the final one, it was a bit of a quieter night from him, but they didn't need him to do anything particularly special. And we're all going to be a lot happier if he has a really strong performance in his hometown of Las Vegas on Monday and Tuesday. And yeah, I mentioned the other depth guys. I know Nolan Hickman's not typically a depth guy. He's typically a starter, but he came off the bench in this one and had an awesome game. He hit 5 3-pointers on 6 attempts, mind you, 5 of 6 from deep, 15 points, 4 boards, and 2 steals from him. Ben Gregg, 10 and 5 in 19 minutes on 4 of 5 shooting. And then Dominic Harris. Dominic Harris only played 5 minutes in this game at the very end of the game, but he had 8 points. He hit a 3 early in the game, early in his time in the game. A few possessions later, hit another 3, and the next possession down, got a pass down low and finished with a reverse lay-in. Really, really smooth, efficient performance from Dominic Harris. He looked good. He looked ready to play. We'll see what that means for him next year. Again, I'm projecting Salas and Hickman to potentially handle a large majority of the minutes at the guard rotations, but I think there's a very distinct possibility for Dom to step into a much bigger role. It's going to depend what happens with Malachi Smith. That's a huge kind of factor here, because if Smith comes back and Hickman comes back and Salas comes back and you add Dusty Stromer into the mix, it gets a little bit more complicated in terms of what those minutes might look like in the guard rotation. But I absolutely think there is a good chance for Dom to step into a bigger role next year. And he proved what he is capable of doing in a small 5-minute sample size against primarily Chicago State's backups. But you know what? When he has gotten minutes this year, regardless of who the opponent has been, he has looked good. And I think that that's worth acknowledging. Efton Reed also played in this game. He only played 3 minutes. But you know what? I'm just happy to see Efton Reed on the basketball floor. He suffered that back injury a few weeks ago. I think he sat out 3 games. Hadn't seen him at all, but he didn't have the brace on today, was warmed up with the team, got a couple minutes of action. Hopefully that means that if Gonzaga needs to turn to him in an NCAA tournament or even a WCC tournament game, that he will be ready to roll. Anton Watson did not make the All-WCC first or second team. Drew Timme was named co-WCC Player of the Year, which felt a little disrespectful, quite honestly. We're going to talk more on that after a word from today's sponsor, FanDuel. The midway point of the NBA season is here, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because new customers get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores and threes drained. Maybe you like Domantas Sabonis to keep putting up huge numbers for Sacramento. Maybe you like Zach Collins in his new role with the Spurs to keep up the high production. Maybe you like to make an exclusive bet, betting on Corey Kispert to hit 2 threes in the first 3 minutes of Washington's next game. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags, and I still want to thank all of you for making Locked On Zags your first listen of the day. For your second listen today, now that it's March, check out the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. It's everything you need to know about college basketball in one place. You hear from big-name experts, insiders, coaches, and players. Locked On College Basketball, available on YouTube and wherever you get podcasts. All right, let's talk about these WCC awards. For those of you who've been listening to the show fairly regularly, you know that I submitted my WCC award projections, predictions, thoughts, feelings, etc. in an episode last week. I also talked a few days after that about specifically the WCC Player of the Year award for Drew Timme, and I talked about how Timme was going to be in a competition, a heated competition with LMU guard Cam Shelton and Santa Clara guard Brandin Podziemski. Well, Drew Timme ended up splitting the award with Brandin Podziemski. He was named co-WCC Player of the Year. For starters, Drew becomes the first back-to-back winner of the WCC Player of the Year award since Blake Stepp. That was a long time ago that Blake Stepp was WCC Player of the Year in back-to-back years. I was a little surprised that nobody else has done that since then. However, thinking about it, Gonzaga seems to rotate through high-level players fairly consistently, so it seems like we've seen multiple different players from Gonzaga almost steal that award from each other in back-to-back years. Players like Kelly Olynyk only really had one elite season where they would have won that award, so I guess it kind of makes sense, but it still felt surprising to me that it's been 20 years since we've had back-to-back WCC Player of the Year award winners. Drew Timme absolutely deserved this, and that's not to say that Brandin Podziemski did not deserve this. Those things are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but in my mind, you should pick one. Dan Dickau kind of said that on the broadcast. He said it's Player of the Year. And I kind of agree with that. And I think if you're going to pick one of these two guys, you got to go with Drew. Drew is second in the conference in points per game behind Cam Shelton. Podziemski was third. Drew is fourth in the conference in rebounds. Drew is ninth in the conference in assists. Beyond that, he had the highest win shares. He had the highest usage rate. He was on a better team. And as Richard Fox said, Richard Fox had a lot of thoughts about this, and I loved it. I appreciated it. He basically said, I hope I don't get in trouble for what I said on the broadcast, which I hope that he does not either. I don't think that he should, but he was a little fired up about it. He had feelings about where Drew Timme should have been here, and basically said, one of these guys is going to be an All-American, and one of them is not. And he's right. He's right about that. Should that necessarily determine the award? No, not necessarily, but Drew Timme was on a better team. He scored more points. He was a higher usage rate. He had a better field goal percentage. Yes, Brandin Podziemski had more rebounds, which matters. I mean, it's not the biggest thing in the world, but Brandin Podziemski is a guard who had more rebounds per game than Drew Timme. He also had more assists per game, although barely, a 0.2 assists per game difference when you consider that Drew Timme is a center. But Podziemski was 11th in usage rate compared to Drew Timme, who was first. Podziemski did have a higher box plus minus, but to me, it's Drew. Better team, like I said, the kind of the focal point of the conference, the most well-known player, the top of every scouting report, and he still went out and scored 20-plus points per game. He still led this team to very, very few losses in conference play. It should have been Drew. And I'm not that crushed about this. Some people, I saw social media a few hours after this came out, some people had some real feelings about this, and I'm not going to tell anybody how to feel about anything, but the WCC awards just don't matter that much to me. To be perfectly honest, they don't. But I think that they probably got this one half right. I was going to say not wrong necessarily, but only half correct. I think Podziemski should have been all WCC first teamer, and I think if there was a second place, it should have been him. But they kind of determined that instead of there being a second place, there's just 2 first place, and I'm not sure that I agree with that. The perhaps more egregious or more upsetting, at least for me, of the award decisions was Anton Watson being an honorable mention. And I'll be clear, for those of you who listened to my episode a few weeks ago when I discussed my awards, I also had Anton Watson as an honorable mention. His performance over the last few weeks and some of the performance of the other players would have made me change my mind. I think if I had actually submitted a vote for this, I would have at least had him on the second team. I think it's difficult to not even have him there. And I think the first note here is that there are a lot of very talented players in WCC. And I think that a lot of the initial reaction to this was that, like, how can there be this many players better than Gonzaga's players? And it's not, all WCC awards are not necessarily just a list of the best players. I don't think Marcellus Earlington is a better player than Anton Watson, but I think Marcellus Earlington averaging 18 points per game for even a not very good San Diego team, for example, probably makes him more deserving of being an all WCC award member. And there's some politics that go into that and various other things, and that's fine. But Anton Watson, he led the WCC in offensive rating. He was 6th in the WCC in win shares. He was 6th in the WCC in player efficiency rating. So basically, he was one of the most efficient offensive players in the entire conference, clearly. He was 4th in the conference in box plus minus. He was top 6 offensively. He was 6th offensively and 4th defensively. So he's a borderline top 5 player in the conference, both offensively and defensively, using the box plus minus numbers. He was 2nd in steals, 2nd in steals per game, 1st in steal percentage. We know that's one of his strongest attributes to this team, is his ability to take away the basketball. It's just hard to not rank him over some of those second teamers. Again, there's an argument for him on the first team, and I think you could absolutely make it. But for me, the immediate look is like, I would take him over Keyshawn Justice and Moses Wood, who were both on the second team. I would take him over both those guys. I've watched a fair amount of Santa Clara basketball. I watched even more Portland basketball this year. I think Moses Wood's very good, but he's fairly one-dimensional. He's an outside shooter. He can get to the rim a little bit, doesn't play great defense. Anton Watson's just better. You ask any coach in the conference who they would rather have on their team, nobody's going to take Moses Wood. And again, I'm not trying to trash him in particular, but I'm just telling you that that's the truth. That is the absolute truth. And so for me, that's not necessarily how you should determine awards, but I think Anton Watson should have made the second team over those guys. I think you could make a very strong argument that he should have made the first team. And I think you can make an argument for him as Defensive Player of the Year. That's the only other award that I really had any major issue with. But the thing about the Defensive Player of the Year award, Gonzaga was not a good defensive team this year. There is no beating around the bush there. There is no sugarcoating that. It is a fact. St. Mary's, on the other hand, was an elite defensive team this year. Elite. One of the very best in the entire country. They have multiple really, really good individual defensive basketball players. Gonzaga has a few, but really Anton Watson is their best defensive player, who would have been in consideration for this award. Hunter Salas is a phenomenal defensive player, but I don't think his minutes were really enough for him to be in consideration here. I'm not surprised it went to a St. Mary's player. I'm a tiny bit surprised it went to Logan Johnson, quite honestly. I think Kyle Bowen is a better defensive player. I thought Mitchell Saxon, being one of the leading rebounders and the leader in blocks per game, would have been in more consideration there. But they basically gave the award to Logan Johnson for being one of the best players on the best defensive team. And I'm not sure I love that. And I think there's a strong argument that Anton Watson could have won it over Logan Johnson. But when you consider how different those two teams are in terms of their overall defensive ability, I'm not surprised that the voters leaned giving it to somebody on St. Mary's. And like I said, I'm pretty much fine with the other awards. Malachi Smith got 6th Man of the Year over Rudy Williams at BYU. I was a little bit surprised by that, but I'm also very happy with it. Malachi Smith was a truly fantastic microwave scorer coming off the bench, had some really, really big games, had many games where he led Gonzaga in scoring or was top 2 in scoring, many games where he led the team in minutes coming off the bench. You don't see that all that often. Those are the kind of things that tend to get you in consideration for this type of award. Bennett Coach of the Year, that's the right call. It deserves to be him. The other candidate there really would have been Stan Johnson. Let's try that again. The LMU head coach. But I think Bennett probably deserved that one here. So yeah, I think I'm okay with generally what happened with the awards. But Drew Timme should have been a solo winner for the WCC Player of the Year. And Anton Watson should have been on the second team and maybe should have won Defensive Player of the Year. I didn't mention Julian Strawther was also on the first team. He's the other player for Gonzaga who was on this list, and absolutely well-deserved for his placement there. All right, Drew Timme is gone. Rasir Bolton is gone. Let's talk about them and also the other seniors and what we might expect from them this offseason. Who's coming, who's staying, what the situation might be right after this. All right, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked on Zags, still talking seniors here. The final game of Drew Timme's home career in Spokane happened Wednesday night against Chicago State. Rasir Bolton's final home game of his collegiate career as well. We'll talk about those guys briefly. We'll also talk about 3 other players and whether we think they're going to be back next year or not. We'll start with Drew Timme. We talked about Drew a lot on Wednesday's show. If you missed it, highly recommend it. It was a fun kind of conversation about how Drew Timme not only embodies what Gonzaga basketball is and has been for many years, but he also kind of embodies college life. And he just embodies that, the spirit of a college kid, the kind of what you expect from college students is who Drew Timme is. And I talked about that in more detail on Wednesday's show. It's going to be a hard world without Drew Timme on the basketball team. But for me personally, I mentioned this on Twitter. I'm not sure if I mentioned it on the show, but my first podcast ever about Gonzaga basketball was the Zags Score podcast, was what I started before I took over as the host of Locked on Zags. And I talked about Drew Timme on like my second episode ever because he was right before his freshman season. That's when it was. I have not podcasted about Gonzaga without Drew Timme on the roster. It hasn't happened. So it's going to be a bit of an adjustment for me. I think in theory, he could shock the world and come back, but I don't think he's going to. If you didn't listen to the Gimme Timme podcast, his own podcast with Noah Bruno, I would suggest checking out, or at least find the clips on Instagram, on Twitter, of just the clips of him specifically talking about his time at Gonzaga. Because he mentions how hard of a decision it was last year, but this year he just feels ready to go. He feels like it's his time. He's accomplished what he wanted to accomplish. He has so much love for Spokane, so much love for Gonzaga, and it was really, really nice to listen to. Sad to lose Drew Timme, but understandable, and wish him nothing but the absolute best. Rasir Bolton decided to take his extra year of eligibility and come back to Spokane last season. Getting 2 years of Rasir Bolton was incredible. He was more of an up and down player this year. He was not as consistent in his role. It took him a little bit longer to find it. There was some frustration a little bit about kind of where he was and why he wasn't as consistent as we saw from him last year. But when he was on, man, he was really on. In the last few weeks, he has been coming around screens and going downhill and getting towards the basket. And when he can do that, when he can finish that way, he's really unstoppable. And as Gonzaga's third scorer, a player who can do that, he's going to be an integral part of what this team is trying to do for the rest of this month. Beyond that, he's a charitable guy. He came to Spokane with NIL opportunities, and the first thing he chose to do was to get involved in the homeless community, helping get backpacks for homeless people in the Spokane community, raising tons of money, awareness. And that impact goes so far beyond the incredible impact that he has had on the basketball floor. Rasir Bolton, for a 2-year player in Spokane, will be dearly missed, not just from his basketball contributions again, but because of who he was off the court. He's one of my favorites. I'm going to be sad to see him gone, but I'm so happy that we got 2 years from him. After that, it gets a little bit murkier. How many more players played their final game at the McCarthy Athletic Center on Wednesday? We don't know. We know those 2 guys did with near 100% certainty. We know it with 100% certainty for Rasir, with 90 plus, 95 plus, 99 plus % certainty for Drew Timme. But after that, it gets a little bit murkier. Anton Watson completed his 4th season in Spokane on Wednesday. That was his 4th year, but it was not his final year of eligibility. As we know, players part of the COVID-19 season, they have gained an extra year of eligibility. Anton Watson could come back. I don't know what he is going to do. I have maintained that Watson is a true 50-50 to me right now. He is from Spokane. He played at Gonzaga Prep. He has been kind of an iconic figure in Spokane and in Gonzaga lore for years now, close to a decade. I could see him coming back, taking on a bigger role, helping to fill the void offensively for Drew Timme being gone, and really kind of running it back in a way that makes him like the best player, like the focal point of this team. I think if Mark Few and the staff can sell him on, hey, when we come down the floor, all those opportunities where we look for Drew right away, we're going to look to you. And you're going to be the one who has to make the determinations on, hey, I'm getting doubled, I'm going to kick it out, or hey, I got single coverage, I'm going to go to the basket and try to score, while also being, if he's upset he didn't win Defensive Player of the Year this year, he can come back and win it next year. He can come back, make that all WCC first team. I think those things are all within the realm of possibility for Anton Watson to come back. Having said that, I could also see him saying, hey, I've been here 4 years. I did my part. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go play professionally. I'm ready to get my degree. I'm ready to move on. So his will be an interesting story to follow because it really kind of is a big domino in terms of what Gonzaga does with the rest of their front court. Do they go find a transfer? Do they rely on Efton Reed to be more of a player next year? What does Watson returning mean for Ben Gregg? Does it mean Ben Gregg stays coming off the bench next year? Does it mean Gregg slides into the 4 and Watson bumps up to the 5? Lots of kind of conversations that we'll have more of throughout the offseason once we kind of get a better sense of what Watson might be doing. Next up is Malachi Smith. Malachi Smith could pull a Rasir Bolton, be a graduate transfer who comes to Spokane and plays 2 years as opposed to just playing 1. I have heard rumblings that he's probably only going to play 1 year, but they are not substantiated, and there's no indication that he has made a decision either way. I did not think Rasir Bolton was going to come back. At this time last year, I was probably 80-something% sure that Rasir Bolton was a one and done in Spokane, and he came back. So I don't want to make any kind of guarantees about Malachi Smith. It would be awesome to get him back. And I mentioned kind of earlier in the show, him coming back is a big domino in terms of what's going to happen with Hunter Salas and Nolan Hickman and what's going to happen with Dominic Harris and what's going to happen with Dusty Stromer. But Malachi Smith, if he were to return, would instantly have a big role on this team next year. He's a good outside shooter. He's good at using his physicality to get around the rim. He's got that floater game strong. His on-ball defensive instincts are very, very good. I think he'd be a huge player to have back. But again, I'm about 50-50 on him right now as well. If I had to absolutely guess, I'd say he's probably gone, but I would not be shocked if he came back either. And then there's Julian Strawther. Julian Strawther is probably gone. That's my projection here. I also felt fairly confident that he was going to leave last year, and he did not. So again, who knows? But at this point, Strawther's recent performances have really put him back squarely on the map, not just as a, hey, maybe he's a late second round guy if he decides to come out of the draft, to now like, hey, he's a late first, maybe early second round guy. And if he performs well at the combine, which he did last year in terms of testing, he did not scrimmage, but he tested, and he tested very well from an athletic standpoint. Assuming he tests well in that perspective next year or this year, and he's got more tape. He's got more tape of him hitting NBA range threes, putting together the floater, playing more aggressive defensive styles, all of that stuff. I think he fits, and I've talked about this on a recent podcast as well. I think he fits the modern NBA game really well. He's a good three-point shooter. He's got good size. He's good at using his size to be impactful on the defensive end of the floor. I think he's a high-level role player in the NBA from day one. And I think a good team in the late first round could absolutely draft him and plug him and play him into a role right away. That's it for the guys that we kind of want to talk about here. There obviously could be other departures. They would be transfers, and we just don't know. We have theories as to some players who maybe aren't playing as much as they should, or they feel like they should, and then those players may choose to move on, and that's the reality we're in right now. That's just the way that college basketball works, is you got to kind of re-recruit your roster every single year. So maybe we'll see some more movement. Who knows? But right now, those are the players that I think there's a reasonable expectation that they may have played their final game in a Gonzaga uniform on Wednesday against Chicago State. All right, that's going to do it for me today. We're talking Lady Zags and previewing the WCC tournament to close out the week on Friday. I'll be in Las Vegas recording the next couple of episodes, Monday and Tuesday of next week. If you're there, let me know. Shoot me a message on Twitter, Andy Patton CBB. Shoot me an email, andypatton013@gmail.com. Trying to say hi to people, trying to meet some of you all as we kind of get a chance to gather together in the desert and watch the Zags for 2 more games. Hopefully 2 more victories as they win the WCC tournament and get a higher seed in March. Also, check out the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, myself, co-host Isaac Shade, as we continue to break down the most exciting month of the college basketball season. It is available wherever you get podcasts, available on YouTube as well. Go hit that subscribe button for both shows on YouTube if you haven't done so yet. Help welcome us into March. All right, thank you all for listening, and go Zags.